Welcome to Agents of Deterioration, Threats to Collections, a presentation in Module 2 of the PACO project, Preparing Alaska's Cultural Organizations for Emergencies, funded in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm Ellen Carley, the Objects Conservator at the Alaska State Museum. In this presentation, I'll be introducing you to the Agents of Deterioration, a collections risk management tool popular in museums since the 1990s. You'll find versions of this approach promoted by organizations such as the National Park Service, the American Institute for Conservation, and the Canadian Conservation Institute. You can think of these like a checklist when you're assessing hazards and risks to collections. For our Alaskan collections, I've created an online guide on the Alaska State Museum website to assist cultural organizations across Alaska with our specific issues. Most professionals agree on the 10 basic agents explored on that website. Light, illustrated on our poster by a light meter testing a display case. Pests, shown as bugs around a coin for scale. Temperature, as represented by this data logging device with a Fahrenheit readout. Relative humidity, illustrated by white patches of mold on brown leather. Dissociation, shown by a small lost tag lying on a floor near a shelf. Thieves and vandals, illustrated by a man's hand holding a padlock, severed by bolt cutters. Fire is shown by a scorched portion of a totem pole. Pollutants, indicated by a rotten slice of onion stuck to the corner of a book. Water, represented by a document with bleeding purple ink. And physical forces, illustrated by a torn sealskin jacket with its red lining exposed. You may notice some of these illustrations appear to be emergencies and some do not. Let's review a few terms from our emergency preparedness training. A hazard refers to something that has the potential to do harm. Those 10 agents of deterioration can be thought of as hazards. A risk is the likelihood of a hazard causing harm. The amount of information available to you in this PACO training might seem overwhelming, but keep in mind this notion of likelihood in setting your priorities. Mitigation involves an action to reduce or eliminate risks. In using the 10 agents of deterioration to help assess risks and hazards for emergency planning purposes, I'd encourage you to think of an emergency as an acute incident instead of a chronic, cumulative, ongoing preservation issue. The agents of deterioration approach is flexible enough to address both, but I'm going to focus on acute incidents that can be addressed by emergency preparedness. Let's start with extreme temperatures. Very low temperatures can cause ice formation, which can lead to damage for damp collections as well as burst pipes, both resulting from the 9% expansion of ice in the solid form from water in the liquid form. Many materials are also more brittle at low temperature and thus more vulnerable. High temperature risks softening and failure of polymers like plastics and adhesives, causing them to slump or get sticky. Higher temperatures also promote accelerated chemical degradation of all kinds. In the presence of elevated humidity, warm temperatures risk mold. The image shows a data logger used to track temperature and humidity. Knowing what kind of an HVAC system your building has and what the normal range of temperature and humidity are is a cornerstone of mitigating risk from those factors. HVAC, of course, refers to heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. These two graphs show a typical museum in Alaska that has temperature control but no humidity control. The graph in red on the left shows an indoor temperature of around 65 degrees year-round. The graph in blue on the right indicates the relative humidity for the same building, indicating excessively low humidity below 30% in the winter months and brief periods of high humidity in the summer. High humidity when we talk about collections is generally starting around 60%. Ideally, museums that can control humidity aim for a steady 45 or 50%. How much of a risk extreme humidity poses as an acute emergency depends partly on the kinds of materials in your collection. Paper, books, and materials made from plant and animal sources will be at special risk for mold from high humidity. Corrosion to metals will also be exacerbated. Low humidity can cause shrinkage and embrittlement, so objects like drums, kayaks, ivory, paintings, and furniture, things that feature restrained materials. Those risk cracking, warping, and flaking. The image on the left shows a drum where the skin is restrained on the wooden hoop and cannot shrink without tearing. The image on the right shows white mold on feathers. In your facility, keep an eye out for signs of mold. The conditions favoring mold are relative humidity over 70% and temperature of over 70 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 days. This is especially true in situations with stagnant air. When RH approaches 60%, there's a likelihood that there are stagnant air pockets in corners and out-of-the-way places that are even higher RH, perhaps approaching that 70% threshold. Dormant mold spores are everywhere all the time. It's only a matter if the conditions are right for them to become active. These images show dark spots of mold low down on white walls and in corners. Pests, such as insects and mice, are another agent of deterioration. The image on the left shows a variety of so-called heritage eater bugs around a dime for scale. On the right is a detailed image of a fur boot that's being eaten by clothes moths, indicated by loose fur, grazed surfaces where brown boot sole is removed, revealing the lighter leather underneath, and small white cocoons. A live insect infestation is an emergency incident for a collection. When surveying your building, check inside and out for ways pests can enter your facility. On the left is a gap around a pipe that allowed mice to enter collection storage from an adjacent space. On the right is a so-called sanitary perimeter around the exterior of the museum where dirt and plants are not allowed to be up close to the building, and issues of the physical structure can easily be seen. The tree in this case was partially rotted and a home for carpenter ants. Good museum practice calls for an integrated pest management system, which is a holistic way to manage the risk from pests without resorting to toxins. On the left is a blunder trap, a disposable sticky paper tent that is placed in a prearranged location to catch bugs. Regularly monitoring this kind of a trap helps identify and narrow down the source of an infestation should one occur. On the right is a freezer kept in the facility, both to respond quickly to an infestation if one is detected, but also for routine freezing of incoming materials to prevent infestation in the first place. A freezer can also be helpful to buy time for some kinds of collections impacted in a water emergency. Fire. Now it sounds like we're getting into emergency planning, doesn't it? Fire is hopefully a low risk if you have good policies and procedures in place at your institution, but the consequences of the fire can be catastrophic. This image of a decorated baleen plaque shows not only a burnt object, but the details of the design are obscured by soot, and the drip marks on the wall indicate water damage has occurred. So we're dealing not only with fire as a hazard, but the resulting soot contamination and water damage as well. Sometimes collections contain things that are themselves hazardous when it comes to fire. On the left is an old piece of military ordnance that might behave like an explosive if it became hot. On the right are examples of antique fire extinguishers that might contain carbon tetrachloride, an obsolete fire suppressant that can deteriorate into toxic phosgene fumes if it gets hot. Many heritage professionals are aware of the flammability of nitrate negatives and films. Do you have any of these kinds of hazards in your collections? What about fire risks in the facility? Are things plugged in appropriately? On the left is an example of an electrical outlet with wires inserted in a dangerous fashion. On the right is a gorgeous old stove in a beautiful robin's egg blue color. If cooking activities happen in your facility, this is automatically an area for vigilance. Good emergency preparedness means knowing your facility. Typically, the staff of an Alaskan cultural institution doesn't have full control over the care and maintenance of their building. Those duties often fall to experts who work elsewhere. But protecting collections requires you to become familiar with your building. I already mentioned the HVAC system. The same is true of your fire detection and fire suppression systems. No one is asking you to become an engineer to understand in detail how these work, but you do need to know the basics. And it's super smart to be on a first-name basis with those experts who are directly responsible for maintaining this equipment. Here, for example, we see elements of a halon fire suppression system. This kind of a system smothers the fire with inert gas stored in the red cylinders in the photo on the right. On the left is an image of the emergency override controls to prevent an accidental discharge. Here's an image of a fire truck on the street and firefighters responding to a fire. Hoses, boots, backpacks, and other equipment may come tromping through your space. Does your collection space look like this? These paintings and artworks, stacked in groups on the floor and leaned against cabinets, are very vulnerable to being kicked and knocked over. However, the items inside the cabinets are quite well protected. Take a look at the ceiling in areas containing collections. Are there sprinkler heads? In our old building, the fire marshal regularly had to remind us that objects stored on top of cabinets were too close to the sprinklers. Usually that distance is 18 inches. Are there hazards that might knock off a sprinkler head, such as these painting racks with moving panels in the image on the left? On the right is an image of our old collection storage space that had a drop ceiling. Above it was an area that had been fireproofed with asbestos during building construction in the 1960s. This room was protected by halon, and a discharge nozzle can be seen highlighted by the ceiling light fixture in the image. Inert gas fire suppression systems typically discharge with significant force and can physically toss around nearby objects. In this case, a brittle branching piece of coral and a delicate three-dimensional abstract sculpture made from sticks and thin string are in harm's way on top of the cabinet. Furthermore, in this example, the force of the discharge would also likely displace ceiling tiles and contaminate the space with asbestos. 2 staff members received the 80-hour asbestos abatement training to prepare for that possibility, but the overcrowded storage space regularly caused us to struggle to keep our collections off those cabinet tops. Water is the most likely hazard that you will encounter in an emergency. In my 20 years of museum work, a water emergency comes up for me or someone I serve about once a year. Because threats from water are not a matter of if, but when, having robust plans in place to deal with water emergencies is a good use of your planning resources. The image on the left shows a document ruined by water, causing the purple ink to bleed. The image on the right shows an old document that has staining and puckering from water damage in the past. On the left here is an image of an active water incident with wet ceiling tiles and liquid water cascading down the yellow wall in this collection storage space. In this example, the wall was a below ground exterior wall and the hose bib attachment outside was faulty. When groundskeeping staff hooked up a hose and turned on the water, it flowed down this wall. On the right is an archivist on a red ladder between 2 tall shelving units of boxed records, tipping a deluge of water off the top of a soaked box. This was from the 2009 Alaska State Archives flood caused by a storm during a roofing project. If you have an integrated pest management program, you will have small paper blunder traps in the hidden corners and crannies of your facility to trap bugs. Checking these traps quarterly not only monitors the bugs, but also other facility issues. If you see evidence of the trap getting wet, like the image on the left, that's an important indicator of a water-related problem. Likewise, if you see white crusts between the floor tiles, like the image on the right, or those white crusts along floor seams and cracks at ground level, this is an indicator of rising damp and that this area is at risk of flooding if the outside ground becomes saturated. In addition to looking for water issues down below, look up high as well. As you tour your facility looking for vulnerabilities and hazards, keep an eye out for green corrosion on copper pipes. This indicates the pipe is getting wet in that location, and it usually means there's a pinhole leak. Ceiling tiles are an excellent indicator of water issues, past and present. On the left is an image of an actively wet stain on a ceiling tile in between the wall and the light fixture. In order to track that stain, a line was drawn around it with a black marker and dated. On the image on the right, you'll see a second stain next to this one, marked on the edge with another date. Tracking stains and leaks can help identify ongoing issues, as well as reveal when a new issue arises. We had these leaks noted on leak maps in the facility too. This kind of data proves to administrators the scope and urgency of a risk and increases the likelihood it will be addressed. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. It is an especially apt in the situation requiring justification of government spending. Strive to quantify and measure these hazards, and that's why we talk about graphs of temperature and humidity, counting the type and number of insects on a quarterly basis, and mapping leaks with dates. This kind of data becomes actionable for preventing emergencies in the first place. The image on the left is a bulging ceiling tile that has water building up behind it. On the right is an image of a ceiling leak being addressed by a facility maintenance expert. You see a man on a blue ladder, a portable dehumidifier in the foreground, and plastic tarping over much of the floor and cabinets. If someone has to come into your collections or exhibit space to address a leak, what will that look like in your space? Can they move around? What would need to be tarped? If there is a sudden water leak or a plumbing issue in your facility, one of the first steps after pausing to consider personal safety is to shut off the water. Where does that happen in your building? Who knows where that water shutoff is located? Are there enough staff empowered to turn off the water in the event of an emergency? On the left is a water pipe with domestic water shutoff written directly on the pipe insulation with an arrow pointing to the valve. On the right is a confusing mess of pipes and gauges along a yellow wall. This was the main water shutoff for this entire museum, and it was located along a back wall of a collection storage space that only a few people had keys to access. This was recognized as a significant vulnerability in their emergency response plan. As an agent of deterioration, physical forces are a threat to collections. These can be acute sudden events such as earthquakes, riots, and landslides, but also more routine activities such as handling, exhibition, transportation, and vibration. A sudden emergency event such as an earthquake can involve physical forces followed by additional physical forces in the recovery efforts, such as handling and transportation. They're also hazards. Planning, storage, and exhibition with mitigation of physical forces in mind through good storage mounts and handling training can help prevent or minimize damage from disaster-related physical forces. The image here illustrates a display of baskets on small, slick plexi shelves without retention. They have fallen from vibration of footfalls near the exhibit case, but the result from an earthquake would be similar. Better exhibit design could have lowered the risk from either physical force hazard. Regarding earthquakes, look through your collection storage and exhibition spaces and consider what could fall. On the left is an image of art bins for framed items that have bungee cords across the openings to prevent the art from shaking out of the bins and falling to the floor. In the center is a large carved house post that is both restrained to the wall by a padded nylon strap and also restrained by the wooden structure that was used to move it on a pallet jack. On the far right are some open compactorized furniture shelves that also show chairs being padded and restrained by elastic bungee cords, and they have plastic hooks that attach to the storage shelving. I also recall that during building construction several years ago, contractors were sent in to add seismic strapping and cables to those air ducts hanging from the ceiling in the photo. Theft and vandalism are risks for all collections due to the factors of value and public access. Many of those issues are addressed from a policy and procedure standpoint, but don't forget the vulnerability of collections that are stored outside the protective envelope of the main facility. The picture on the left shows temporary structures that were overflow storage for the Alaska State Museum in the 1980s, including 2 shipping containers and the corner of a temporary shed in the back of a parking lot. Out of sight, out of mind. These locations faced numerous emergency incidents and were always at a higher risk for theft and vandalism because they were separate from the main facility. On the right, a man's hand holds a padlock that's been cut. This padlock was found at an off-site storage facility where oversized collections of that institution were kept in shipping containers. You should include these off-site locations as part of your emergency planning and hazard assessment. Pollutants, contaminants, and toxins can cause ongoing issues with collections, but are often not the focus of an emergency incident. However, awareness of the kinds of toxins present in your collection that could harm emergency responders and staff in the wake of an incident are important to identify. On the left is an herbarium specimen known to have been treated with mercury as pesticide. On the right is a bird specimen that has been bagged and tagged with a skull and crossbones symbol and the words danger, arsenic. Lead corrosion, such as the white crusts seen on the lead hands of this model kayaking figure, is a hazard present in many collections. On the right is a fuzzy spot of mold on a seashell. Stocking personal protective equipment in preparation for handling such collections is an important part of emergency preparedness as well as routine collections management. Sometimes disaster recovery involves volunteers, and you should be prepared to warn and protect them too. These images, while a little dark, show examples of hazards that are associated with collections and may require some additional preparation in order to deal with safely. On the left is a mineral sample of asbestos. If this needed to suddenly be removed from a smashed exhibit case, what would the responder need to know in order to be safe? On the right is a small plastic vial containing a radioactive mineral specimen. What if the vial were partly melted in a fire? What kinds of gloves or personal protective equipment would ensure the safety of the responder? How will you list these hazards? And how will staff be made aware of them in training? Dissociation is the term used when physical collections cannot be connected to their records. The image on the left shows a detail of various labeling materials tested in water. These small paper labels have codes on them, indicating which adhesive and material type were being tested. The label floating on top was adhered using a water-soluble adhesive that was easy to apply, but failed easily when it got wet again. On the right is a crowded office full of cardboard boxes, files, and books. If these were impacted by fire or flood, are there backups of key records? Would you be able to quantify what has been lost or damaged for insurance purposes, and to begin writing grants that would replace the lost collections and reference materials? Would you know which of these boxes or books were top priority? Here again are those 10 agents and the web resource developed at the Alaska State Museum to help think about them. I encourage you to walk through your collection spaces with a list of these 10 potential hazards as a sort of a checklist. Emergency preparedness involves an overwhelming amount of information and possibilities, but just like collections care is on a spectrum with constant efforts at improvements, emergency preparedness is also a continuous process. Awareness and vigilance about these threats are a constant part of your professional practice. This has been Agents of Deterioration, Threats to Collections in Module 2 of the PACO program, Preparing Alaska's Cultural Organizations for Emergencies, brought to you by the Alaska Division of Libraries, Archives, and Museums, and generously funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thanks for watching.